Hi guys, this is Wise Dragon Comics. It's been a while since I made a manga practice video, so bear with me on it as I get back into the swing of things. So this one is actually going to be about just inking basics, and I'm just going to cover multiple parts. I even well, probably can't see that. I made some notes about the things that we're gonna go over. So this will be the things. First part is basically about dipping. So I'm gonna go ahead and explain some things about dipping real quick. One of the first things is there's, depending on how much ink you want on your brush, on your nib, it doesn't matter too much. The only time it does matter is when you actually dip a lot on there, and then you start to actually see it start to bead at the bottom. Like you can probably see it. It looks almost like it might drip. But sometimes if it gets a little too much, like this, you can end up getting like that. So if you start to see it bead a little bit, one thing you can do is take one part of the nib and just rub it against the side, and it'll take some of the ink off. This way you won't get it dripping, then you won't have to deal with it. Then mainly I just try to cover mine to about this much or so, sometimes a little bit less. You may not want to dip it all the way in there or put that much ink on your nib, depending on the kind of ink that you're using. There are certain kinds of inks like the water soluble, I don't know how you say that word, soluble ones, which when you put it on the paper, even after the ink dries, you can still use water to spread it out and make different kinds of effects. I'm not really going to explain that in this video, but what I'll say is there's those kind of inks, and the other kinds of inks are the waterproof ones. The waterproof ones is once it dries, if you were to put water, like once it after you put it on the paper, and then once it actually dries on the paper, if you were to put water on it, the ink won't be it won't come up, and you won't be able to use certain kinds of like watercolor type of effects, like wet on wet or wet on dry or anything. But usually those waterproof inks, they dry really quick. So putting those inks on the nib, sometimes I try to put like a little bit less ink on there, because I'll also have to clean the ink off with water more often than I would if I was using a water soluble one. This ink that I'm using now, that I'm dipping the dip pen in, well, this is water, but this ink right here is one of my favorite inks. It's Icy Comic Premium Type 1. It's really hard to find. For the most part, I was able to just find it regularly on Amazon, but over the years, people on Amazon stopped selling it, at least on the American Amazon. So the most recent batch that I got, I ended up having to go to make an account for the Japanese Amazon, basically setting it to English language, and I did have to use a different email. That's how you will have to do it. It's not illegal or anything. It's just they just don't allow you to use like the same email for multiple Amazon accounts. But you can use the same card after you use a different email. And so I was able to log on to Japanese Amazon, and then I was able to order a bunch of these because they actually regularly sell them on the Japanese Amazon. And like I said, like I'll log on to the Japanese Amazon, and you can set the language to English, and some places will actually ship to the US. So I just found a person that was selling the comic type Icy Comic Premium Type 1, and then that's how I was able to order it. And if anybody didn't know, I live in the US. So that's one of the things I'll just say about inking. As far as the dipping part goes. So second thing I'm going to explain is Comfort of your grip, that's really up to you. Basically, you just choose a way that allow you to ink better and ink for longer periods of time. Sometimes people have different ways that they make strokes. Some people they mainly like to do moving their fingers or moving like their wrist a bit or moving the arm. The best way to handle inking all together is to use all three at different times, like whenever you feel comfortable with, because you want to extend your endurance for longer periods of time so you can be able to draw longer without getting tired or injuring yourself. You don't want to get carpal tunnel or anything like that. So comfort of your grip is basically, like I said, it's whatever you need it to be. Sometimes I've seen in videos where some people might wrap they might like a thicker nib holder. So what they'll do is they may use a regular one, but they may wrap like a bunch of tape around it or something like that, just because they may like to hold something like thicker. Or some people will have a thinner nib. Basically, whatever suits your comfort. You don't have to use things that you specifically seen in like certain videos. It's mainly up to you. It's kind of like that phrase that what goes around in Naruto: a expert with a rock can beat a novice with a shuriken. So if you're really good with whatever you're comfortable with, you'd be better at that than trying to use something that you're not comfortable with. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is choose your favorite nib. This one's a little more extensive, so depending on what I'm doing, I may use one of these kinds of different kinds of nibs. Mainly my favorite nib to use is the Nipponji nib, because it's kind of like a mix between the Cabra or the Saji nib. This one makes straighter lines. It doesn't bend as much. It's a bit of a harder nib. It's harder than the typical mostly used ones like G pens. And yeah, this one's harder than G nibs. This one, its hardness is a little bit less than this one, but it's more than G pens. So I'm able to get a line that's not as straight or thin that this one will make, but it's a thicker. But it's thinner and easier to control than how wide like G pen nibs make their lines. And these are 3 Maru nibs. They're also called like mapping nibs. They're meant for like details. Like for instance, if you want to use if you want to make like straight lines, like straight thin lines, like let's say you're just doing grass, like just trying to make grass. It'd probably be better if I actually showed you what I meant. So now I have 3 different kinds of Maru nibs here. That's because each of them have a different like hardness to them. Now when you hear people talk about how hard or rigid a nib is, what that really means is if a nib is harder, it will bend less. So let's say there's 2 ways to go about this. If a nib is harder, it will bend less, which means when you actually make your line will stay thinner for longer, and it means you actually have to put more pressure on the nib itself to get a thicker line. So what that means is, let's say you are heavy-handed, you might actually want to go with, which one of these was the hardest one? I think the firmest one, it definitely isn't this one. This one's actually on the softer side. I think it's, I think it might be this one right here. So let me test it. Yeah, the firmest one of the Marus, of these three Marus, the firmest one is actually this one right here. So it's harder to, when I press on it, it's harder to actually make a wider line. So it'll actually be easier to make the same kind of line. But let's say I wanted to do hair. This one is the softest of these, even though all of these are actually harder than these. They're firmer than these ones, so they don't actually bend as nearly as much. So let's say I wanted to do hair, but I also wanted to have a little bit of freedom to bend, well, to make wider lines and cause the nib to bend wider. Because when you're pressing down, what you're doing is the teeth will split a bit more. So the harder you press, the more they'll split. This split will allow more ink to flow out. So when you hear people talk about pressing down, if you barely press down, you'll get a thin line. But if you press down harder, more ink comes out, so it comes out thicker. So while you're actually drawing something, you can actually be going for small and then go thick, and then small and then thick again. And this is when you are pressing on it. Now, to also be mindful, when you're pressing down to let more ink flow out, the amount of ink that you put on the nib itself, it'll actually start to like get used more. So it's kind of like having a car and there's a gas tank. Well, the faster you go, the more gas you'll burn. So the harder you press, the more ink will come out, and you'll have to re-dip it. But re-dipping is easy once you get used to it. It's not a big deal. So that's explaining different nibs. Most of the time I don't use these nibs, the Marus, that much, because I barely ever have to draw anything that thin. I don't draw a lot of grass, or sometimes if I want to make details in hair, I might use these. But yeah, so those are the Marus. And the main reason why, I'm gonna put these on the side. The main reason why this Nipponji nib is my favorite is I'm not a fan of it, but it's most people are. That's and that's the G pens. They have a like, since they're like the softest of the nibs, well, this golden one is actually a little bit firmer than this one. I also have another one, and that's okay. So I have 3 different kinds of G nibs. This one is I think it's a chrome plated one. That's why it's like it's gold and yellow. It's supposed to be a bit more rigid and supposed to last longer, but all it is it's a bit firmer than this one is. So when it comes to pressing down, I have to press down more on this one, so it can keep straighter lines easier before it actually starts to widen and put more ink out there. Now, let's say I wanted to draw something that's a bit closer and I needed bigger lines, then I will actually go for this G pen, because it's just easier to get a thicker line as if I was needing to make a thicker line to make a bigger line. And then as far as these G pens go, these 2 G pens are, I think they're the Zebra or the Tachikawa brand ones. This one right here is a Nico brand. The Nico brand, it's actually a bit firmer as a G pen. So since I actually, like I said, I like thinner lines and I like more control rather than rounding lines, I tend to use this Nico G pen more often than I use these. So it's a bit takes a bit more effort to make it bend, so it's easier to make straight lines and easier for me to control. I don't know if it's just me being heavy-handed, but I tend to, when I use G pens from these kind of G pens, my lines end up being thicker than I want them to be, so that's why I don't prefer to use them. But sometimes when I need to make thicker lines, they're there just so I can use them. So I'll put those on the side. Now, like I said, that's my Nipponji pen. Okay, so this is the pen that was my favorite beforehand, before I actually found out about the Nipponji pen. But this is the Cabra or Saji pen. I can't remember which one it is. But it's also referred to as, I think, the Spoon pen. This one was my favorite before this one because I like making straighter lines, so this one was a lot easier at just making straight lines with not a lot of thickness, so I could control the variation, because I didn't like to make variation, like not a lot of, like G pens are really good at making rounded lines or softer, like rounded lines. I don't really like that much. It's just not my style. So this was my favorite pen before this one, because this one, it's easier to, with this one, it's the Nipponji pen, it's easier to make curves when I need to, because this one is if you're not making straight lines, it's also more prone to actually scratch the paper. But this one, it actually is easier to make smoother turns when I need to, so I can actually keep straight lines and actually make curves easier. Where this one is good for making straighter thin lines, but if I need to curve it, actually it's easier to cut it into the paper. I don't know if this will actually show up on, well, yeah, because I don't have the autofocus on. But if I were to zoom in on this, the tip, you know what, let me just draw it. So the tip of this one is pretty much just like that, where it's barely, put that into focus, it's barely there. But with this one, it's actually got a little bit more of a cupping arc. So that's mainly the difference, because this has more of a tip like that. I guess that's one of the reasons why it's easier to glide and make turns before I actually end up scratching the paper, as opposed to using this one. And I keep mentioning about scratching the paper. It's okay to, like, you know, there's those ASMR videos where you hear people scratching the paper. The problem that comes with scratching the paper too much is you eventually dig into the paper, and the way the ink is held into the paper, it'll actually absorb to a point to where it may actually do this weird crinkling effect sometimes. I called it a crinkling effect, but it's like a wiring, to where your line, when you, let's say you draw your line, it'll start to do this mess on it. Sometimes that happens for a couple of reasons. Usually it's because you're scratching the paper and digging way too deep on it. It should just be like that, and not really spread out like that. Yeah, there's also another way, another thing about that is, when you're drawing your lines, you when you start to get like half faded lines like that, usually that means that you probably just don't have enough ink on your nib, so you would need to re-dip it down. You would need to dip it again and get some more ink on it. Sometimes, let's say you were to actually dip your ink, you would actually dip your nib in the ink, and then you start trying to draw, and it does these at first. What that might actually mean is your ink itself might just be a little bit dry, or it might have gotten like a tad bit drier. One of the ways that I'll loosen it up is I usually take this dropper and then I'll use the dropper. I'll suck in like a little bit of alcohol, and then I'll just make one drop of alcohol into the ink, just a small drop, because what it'll do is it'll dilute the ink and actually help like the ink that's in here, and it'll break it up if it's been drying. And then I'll also I'll shoot the rest of the alcohol out back into the alcohol thing, and then I'll just use some fresh water, and then I'll take a couple of drops of that, and then I'll dip, and then I'll shoot a couple of drops also into the ink. So basically the alcohol helps dilute it, and then the ink will kind of replace the alcohol drying, and then keep it diluted a little bit. So that's what I do to actually loosen up ink after a vial has been sitting here. And considering how many ink vials I got sitting over there, a bunch of them tend to do that. More on choosing your favorite nib. You don't always have to swap to a different nib just to do something. You can actually just, if you feel comfortable enough, you can actually just adjust the way you're drawing, and then you can make smaller lines. Sometimes you just need to like practice drawing the smaller stuff, and you can get the same effects from different nibs. Like I mentioned how if I need thicker lines, if I press hard with the G pen, it'll make thick lines. I can also do it with this. It just takes a little bit more effort, but I can make a thick line. All I did, so I can basically mimic the effect of a G pen just by pressing this one a little bit harder. And the same thing with like I talked about Maru pens, the ones that make real fine details. You can still get the same effect just by maybe pressing a little bit lighter. So I can still make real thin lines, and that's from the Maru. This was from this pen. So you don't have to swap pens, you just have to be a little bit more a bit better at the nib that you like to use. So you can even use a G pen that makes real thick lines. You can even make small lines with it too, if you're that. It just requires practice and getting used to. But usually the thicker the line, it means you had to press down harder. A thinner line, it just means you have to press lighter, or basically rather than pressing it, the nib on the paper, you can just kind of like let it sit and barely get any pressure on it, and then you can get a real thin line. These are things that you can practice. I had to practice it so I could get my pressure accuracy better. So this way you can make different kinds of lines. You don't always have to swap or have like a million different kinds of nibs. If you want it easier, sometimes I'm in the mood to where it's like, okay, I don't really feel like focusing that hard on doing a different kind of line, so I'll go for a different kind of nib just so it's easier to do. Now this pen right here, this nib right here, is called the school nib. This one is mainly for making straight lines, like, and I mean not necessarily like thin straight lines like the Maru pen is, but just straight lines, because it can actually hold a lot more ink than the Maru pen does. But it's also like very rigid. Like, it's like this pen basically, if you press into the paper and you try to make a thicker line using this one, you're just going to scratch the paper flat out. This is the pen that I like to use to make my speed lines, because since it's so rigid, and I don't press on it, the nib itself pretty much makes the same thickness of line. Sometimes I'll go to use a thinner ink so that the ink flows better with it. But yeah. Yeah, my favorite basic ink is to use the IC Manga, IC Comic Premium Type 1, which I'm going to actually just refer to the Type 1 because that's a really long name to say. I mean, even Toriyama shortened up Super Saiyan Guy, Super Saiyan into Super Saiyan Blue. So I'm just going to refer to that ink as Type 1. Because there's also different kinds of types. There's a Type 2 and a Type 3. I also have the Type 2, which is it's a waterproof ink. So it works really good. So as with waterproof inks though, it also dries faster, which is good for the paper, but for the ink on the nib, it can be more of a problem. What was I just about to talk about? Oh, I remember now. Alright, so another brand of ink that I like to use is this is called the IC Manga Super Black. This ink, it's one of their waterproof ones. It actually flows a bit smoother. Well, no, it flows faster than this one does. So sometimes the lines that it gives, it shoots out a bit more ink than I want it to. So some of the lines, as the ink is rushing out on the paper, it'll create a thicker line than I want it to. So I have to watch my pressure when I put on the paper. But since it runs faster, if you notice, some of these lines that I made, they like look like they skipped part of it. This one doesn't skip nearly as much, or at all, because the ink just flows better and faster. So just because the ink flows better and faster, depending on what you're trying to get after, it may work for you. But sometimes I do switch inks when I need something. So this one, like I said, the ink flows faster, so if I need to make a lot faster, quicker strokes, this ink does not fail at that. But when I need to make curves or contours sometimes, or I need to really control like the thickness, this ink is a little bit harder to control, so I prefer not to use it for that things. But this was my favorite for a bit until I got more of the Type 1. And the Type 1 is better for like anything that doesn't require like quick inking. Alright, so another thing, the next step that we're going to go to that I'm going to talk about is long strokes of a nib. Some of you, when you ink, you actually do it when you draw too. I don't do it because eventually I just practice myself out of it. Is you do that the hairy kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but when you draw, you do this, and it basically looks like you're doing this. And then when you ink, you end up inking the same way, so you'll end up going like, and you're not even trying to get that kind of texture. So sometimes when you're drawing, something looks like that rather than being straight. Well, the easiest way to actually fix that is, if you want to do long strokes, you need to practice long strokes. So one of the ways that I actually started practicing on inking was I just literally made up a lesson for myself. So what I did was I'd do this maybe a couple of times, like every couple of days, because I didn't want to just like hard grind it into my brain only to forget it. So what I would do is just get some manga paper, and then I would like draw certain things just to be able to practice. So if you have problems when you're inking, like drawing a circle or drawing contours, then just make a lesson for yourself and just grab a scrap piece of paper and just make things on the paper that you want to ink. Same thing with making long strokes. You want to make long strokes? Well, practice making long strokes. So do it in pencil. And then get whatever kind of nib that you want to work on. And that's one of the easiest ways to figure out how to get something, how to do something, is if you think you can get it a certain way, if you think you can figure out a lesson to give yourself, then just give yourself a lesson. So to be able to make contour around lines, I will just make a lesson. Yeah. This also helps you get comfortable with a nib. Sometimes you can think that you like a nib or that you're really comfortable with it, but then you end up finding out that maybe it wasn't the right one that you like to use. But yeah, go at your own pace after you make your lesson for yourself. And mainly to be able to get long strokes is I try to go as long as I can, well, with the stroke without pulling my pen up. So as you can see, I didn't really have to do it. But sometimes I don't try to really just arc my hand all crazy and do it in all kinds of weird ways. There's also another thing that I'll do is rotate the paper. Alright, so I'm going to put a little bit more ink on this than I normally do. And then there's and that's how you, if you can't really follow lines, that's how you try to teach yourself to make longer strokes. So there's that. Yeah, so there was a point where I had trouble making curves, so I was just like, I got mad at myself and I was like, there's got to be a way to do this. And I was like, let me just kind of try to spend a few days. So I was in the middle of a manga page. This was like years and years ago, and I just decided to make a practice lesson for myself. Just like that. So the whole thing about practicing, about getting better at something, is mainly, it's not so much to match something, it's mainly to just get as good as you want at it, to be able to use it. So you don't have to be perfect at it, you just have to have it well enough to be able to match what you're trying to do. You don't need the straightest line, you don't need to be able to make perfect curves to make a perfect circle, because if you're not trying to make a perfect circle, then what's the point of practicing that far into it? It's just kind of a waste of time. All right, and I think that covers like long strokes of a nib. So I'm gonna start explaining something else. All right, so this is one of my triangles that I like to use for straight lines. This one is in fact like bigger than the paper. This is another one that I use. Oops. Another one that I'll use. Then there's another one that I use. All right, so this one's going to be a bit more in detail. Just want a piece of paper. Okay, so this thing I'm about to explain is about actually using a straight edge to make lines. Now, you've probably seen people talk about this before, but maybe there were some things that they definitely didn't cover in detail. I'm going to be real geekish about this. So first one I'm going to do is, I don't really want the paper to move, so I'm just going to use some masking tape. Tape the paper down. Alright, so I'm going to separate these rulers, like these two over here, because I don't use these as much. I don't use these for inking as I used to. I use them for penciling, but not as much for inking. Now, these are what I'll use for inking and penciling, and there's a really specific reason. So there was something I couldn't figure out that was going on, and that was when I would try to ink on the line, sometimes what happens is like I will make one, and then eventually a drop would actually pop on the paper. Now, that's not technically supposed to happen, because you have like coins, because, well, if you keep coins here, it'll keep it from actually touching the paper, as opposed to if you did it with the ruler being directly on the paper, what'll end up happening is that. So putting coins up under the paper is up under the ruler. Coins up under the ruler is supposed to keep the ruler from touching the paper, so you don't get that smear thing. Now, here's what was actually happening that I found out. The actual edge of this ruler is quite wide. Like, let's say this is a triangle. I mean, I called it a ruler. I meant a triangle. This is the edge of the actual triangle. So, what was actually happening to me while I stopped, when I would ink is, eventually, because this is like it's wide and has a lot of surface area, what happens is, as you're using this technique, ink does actually get on the side of here, but because there's so much surface area on here, it was actually building up a lot of ink, and sometimes the ink would actually be able to drop on the paper. So not only was I avoiding this happening from going this way, even though I put the nickels up under the paper, up under the ruler, it was still eventually happening because there was too much ink building on the edge of the ruler. Now that's where these two other rulers come into play. So unlike, I'm gonna wipe the side of this. Unlike these rulers, I keep calling this a ruler, my triangle. Unlike these triangles, this edge right here on these is actually thin. It's actually tapered. You probably can't see it, but I'll actually draw it just to show. So unlike this one, the edge right here, it actually looks like this. So this is the kind of ruler that you actually want to use, because ruler, geez, I did it again. Oops, I did it again. This is the kind of triangle that you want to use, one that actually has a thinner edge, basically has a thinner bezel than this one does. So when it came to that problem where sometimes too much ink will build up on the side of here, I don't run into that problem over here, because it's not enough space for the ink to just build up on there. It'll just end up like spreading itself along the ruler, and then I'll have time to wipe it off. Also, because there's not as much surface area, when I actually have to touch the side of this when it has ink on it, there's less surface area, so there's less that's actually touching this to actually take a lot of ink, because this has a lot more surface area, this has a little bit of surface area, so more of the nib actually touches this part, and more ink will fall off of the nib and onto the edge of the ruler to sometimes end up building up and then dripping on the paper. This one doesn't, so it doesn't pull a lot of ink off of the nib for ink to end up falling on the paper. So I just wanted to explain that about the rulers. Yeah, so if you're looking for a ruler, you might want to look for one that has a that doesn't have a flat edge, but actually has a thinner edge. I'm going to turn the autofocus off. The fixed focus off, so I can hopefully get it into view. Okay. So I think you can actually see it now. Yeah, see how this one right here is like way thinner than this one is. Yeah, swap the focus again so you can actually see. So this one with the thinner area is superior to this one. Now I still use this one for penciling though. All right, what else do I gotta cover in this? I think I already talked about ink drying on the nibs. Yeah, with that other paper, so I'm gonna skip that. Well, I got some other things I do want to cover, so I'm gonna actually just, since this video is going on 45 minutes, I'm going to make a part 2, which I'll cover nibs and talk about fine liner nibs versus fine liners, and how fine liners, most of them tend to fade a little bit when you erase them, but there's not really a way around that, but you can still use both of them. Sometimes if you actually use both nibs and fine liners, you can get the best of both worlds. And fine liners are like these kind of pens. For some reason, I don't know if there's any other. There's like maybe one or a few other fine liners I've dealt with, but I don't know how you pronounce these, Statler brand or whatever. These, for some reason, I don't know what this pigment ink is made out of, but the fade that happens when you need to erase the penciling on something, these barely fade. Like, it's not even really noticeable. Like, I mean, when I say not noticeable, it's really hard to see a difference. And I mentioned something about, well, I guess I might as well just finish the last couple things. And that's on paper to use. So Manga comes in different kinds of paper grade. Well, like not paper grades per se, but paper thickness. The thickness is listed in. Let me grab a pen real quick. The paper thickness might be labeled as either G/M. Well, regular paper is also named like this too, or it may be referred to as GM squared, or it might even say GS/M. All those. Let me pull up the. Yeah, so there you go. So it may say something like GM squared, or GSM. All these mean the same thing, just thickness of the paper. Now you also have something else that comes into play, and that's actually the texture of the paper. Usually when you want to use manga paper, you want either like something that's smooth or like extra smooth. There are some people who prefer to use different kinds of texture, like even like charcoal texture, but the problem when you use those is, since there's ridges on the paper, your lines aren't going to be straight. Some of them might look like this, just because it's going over the ridges of the paper, especially if you're doing fast strokes. There's some people who actually like that. They like it for making the art look a little bit unique. I don't prefer that, so I don't do it. Mainly I just go for extra smooth or smooth type texture, and the thickness that I prefer to use is I like to Usually a decent standard is to go for 130, or let's write the same number twice. 130 or 135. We're gonna call it GSM. That's one of the easiest. That's usually the optimal range to go for when it comes to manga paper. Or you can actually get drawing paper, and it just needs to. It should have at least this kind of thickness level. Because if you're working on like copier or printer paper, that paper is usually something around the lines of like 40 to 60 GSM. When you got paper that's that thin, what ends up happening is the ink pretty much goes right through the paper. Well, it goes on the top, and then it seeps through the thickness of the paper. And as it hits the bottom, number one, it'll start to bleed really bad. It'll actually go down into the paper. Once it hits the bottom, it'll actually start spreading and filling out as it's trying to go through the paper. But thicker paper like the 135s, what happens is the paper is thick enough to where it can actually just hold the ink and it not go all the way through. It'll just go into the paper. So if I were to, yeah, with the thin paper, what'll happen is you'll ink, then it'll go, then it'll hit the bottom, and then it'll just start spreading out because more of the ink that you're putting on there keeps coming out. So it'll start spreading, and then it'll spread along the whole paper. So a line that you initially wanted to be like that ends up becoming like this, and it'll actually get uncontrollable as the ink is starting to spread on the paper. But when you have the thicker kind of paper, what happens is as you put the ink there, it'll just go and it'll just sit basically like that because the ink just gets absorbed because there's a lot more thickness to the paper. Yeah, so the paper that you want to at least start with is usually like 135, and this is for traditional artists. If you use digital, you don't have to worry about that. But for people who use traditional materials, you want to at least aim for like 130 or 135 GSM. Now, what I actually prefer to use is something along the lines of like 180 to 200 GSM paper. It's way harder to find. It was just like way harder to find on different kinds of places like Amazon, and having to look on some other outlets that sell paper. But eventually I found some brands on Amazon that sell white B4 size paper. Oh, you also want to use, that's another thing, B4 size paper. You want to use that. Now you can use A4. A4 is the typical like 8 by 11. Well, it's actually 8.5. 8.5 by 11 kind of manga paper. But real manga paper actually comes in this size, which is something closer to I had to cheat and look over. It's something closer to 11 by 14 inches. I don't know the centimeters. You can actually just Google it and convert that yourself. But yeah, B4 is usually like 11 inches by 14 inches, and A4 is usually 8.5 inches by 11 inches. You really want to try to use this size paper. I like the thicker paper because it gives me more comfort, as in, let's say I know I'll put a lot of ink on the paper and then I'll let it dry. The more ink you put on the paper, you're gonna have to give it a little bit more time to dry. A couple of times I ran into some issues where I was pressing into the paper and it was cutting into it a bit. So when you cut into the paper, it's easier for the ink to hit the bottom and then possibly start spreading all over the place. So that's why I like the thicker paper, because it gives me more comfort. As if I start to make a mistake, like pressing too hard into the paper, this extra thickness compared to this one, it basically allows me to not show. It's harder for me to make a mistake, so it gives me a comfort zone, a buffer zone, and I think it works pretty well. But so far I covered everything that I wanted to. Oh, there wasn't one thing I did forget. Okay, so I mentioned something about fine liners. One thing about using fine liners versus nibs is nibs where's that other piece of paper at? Like I said, with nibs, you can make these varied lines by basically pressing. You can't really do that with fine liners. Fine liners are just pretty much that. If you do press, it'll get like barely thicker, but what you end up doing is, if you press on a fine liner, you end up ruining the tip. So something that might have began as a 0.3, if you keep pressing on it trying to get a thicker line when you're normally supposed to swap to a thicker fine liner, if you end up pressing on it, you'll end up ruining the tip, and the tip won't be as sharp, and it'll end up being something close to like a 0.5, but not even as good as a regular 0.5. Now, when it comes to this very thickness that you can get with a nib, one thing I found to do is, if you need some thickness, just go over the line a couple times and just thicken it out. So if you make that, but you want a certain part thicker, just fill it in a little bit. I know it sounds real simple, but some people don't realize that you can do that. And then if you got either some whiteout or when you scan it into your editing program, you can easily just kind of, clean that up. Yeah, so you want to make a thicker line with fine liners, just keep going over the line a couple times and slowly altering it so you can just thicken it. But I don't like doing all that because it seems like it's extra work, so I just use nibs. So this way, if I need a thicker line, I can just press it. But every now and again, though, I do want the ease of a nib. So I want the ease of a fine liner, so I'll go ahead and use a fine liner. But mainly all I used to use fine liners for was mainly for the making straight lines, because I didn't realize the problem I was having with this ruler issue for like years. So in the past few years, I'd actually bought this triangle and then to use instead of using these ones. So once I was using this one, I noticed I wasn't having that problem where the ink was building up on the edge and then falling on the paper. And I was wondering why that was. So one day I just kind of decided to just take a deep dive into my materials, and that's when I found out that this triangle just has that wider surface area rather than having that the edge like this one. So sometimes you get new materials, you can just look over your materials and you may find out new things that you didn't realize. But yeah, so that's inking basics, and this video took a heck of a lot longer than I thought it was, but I covered everything that I think I wanted to cover. So if you like the video, go ahead and do the things like liking, subscribe if you want to see more videos, because I got a list of videos that I need to start working down of manga practice tutorials. So now that I've kind of got my feet wet again with this one, I'm going to start trying to be more consistent about making videos. All right, see you later.